So, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon. My name is Andrea Avanzini from the University of Brescia, Italy. And the focus of my presentation is the applicability of infrared thermography to fatigue life prediction in the context of additively manufactured metals. In particular, I will present a case study. And the general scenario is that we know that fatigue properties are a critical aspect for the structural integrity in additive manufacturing. It depends on the combination of several factors like porosity, surface finish, microstructure, which in turn are dictated by technology. And there are several technologies. Each technology has a number of parameters that may affect defects, surface finish, and so on. And in this scenario where we have many technologies, they are still evolving. So that means that estimating in a robust way, for example, how parameters, how an optimal configuration may affect fatigue, can be quite challenging and time or price expensive. So this is why it would be particularly valuable to have methods that could predict or at least conduct a screening in a fast way about the fatigue characteristic of the metal. And of course, infrared thermography is one option because we know from previous investigations from different research groups that it has been successfully applied to, let's say, conventionally manufactured metals, also polymers and composites. For AM materials, there are some published studies. Some reported good quality of the prediction, but in some cases, some contrasting findings were reported. So the other aspect that we tried to investigate was whether some differences may exist when applying, for example, different thermal indexes that can be obtained from characteristic measurement of the temperature during the test, and whether the different strategies that can be used to predict the fatigue limit may also have an influence on the quality of the prediction. So that was the background of, let's say, our research and the motivation. And as I say, we applied a case study. So we had some sample from nickel-based alloy, laser powder bed fusion Inconel 625. And this material was available under 4 different heat treatment conditions. So this was part of a previous investigation. And we know from this previous investigation that each condition has not only a different microstructure, but very different mechanical properties. So the effects of these heat treatments was to change significantly Young modulus, the yield strength, and the elongation of break. So we have a family of different mechanical behaviors starting from the same initial condition. And the other information that we had as a starting point is that on the same families of materials, we carried out fatigue testing in, let's say, a conventional way. So pulsating cycle up to 20 million cycles. And what you see here is a representation of the fatigue curves. So I beg your pardon if I remove the stress level because this part of the work is currently under review. But what is important for the purpose of today's presentation is that we have very different fatigue responses in terms of slope of the curve and in terms of fatigue strength for various cycle numbers. Now, moving to the tests that we carried out in this research, we adopted a so-called stepwise protocol. So we had the sample and we applied sequences of block loading consisting of 30,000 cycles. And the sequence of load was increased up to failure. And this is an example of the type of curve that we obtained from the testing. And these are just some details about the setup. So we have let's say a standard infrared camera with a microbolometric sensor, and we spray the sample with painting having a known emissivity, and we place the dump sample close to the test one to have a reference for potential environmental changes. And then we had to set up some script in the LabVIEW and MATLAB environment for, let's say, the acquisition of the thermal images and customization of some aspects about processing. And in particular, two corrections. One is that when we pointed the camera on the equipment, we found there was a slight mismatch in temperature between the upper and the lower grip. So it's not really much in terms of Celsius degrees, but you will see that in some cases the variation, the temperature variation that we measured were very small. So we corrected for this gradient and for environmental effects when necessary. Here you can see just an example of the curve that we got from the experiment. This is the average temperature on the specimen. So we subdivided the curve into 4 main phases. So the first one is the application of the mean stress, then the application of the cyclic stress and its release, and finally the release of the mean stress. And in general, in the central region of the specimen, the temperature was rather uniform, except for, let's say, the final phase, when we're high load level, we reach the fader. So in that case, you have here an example of the classic temperature distribution that we've got. Now, from this analysis, we extracted some thermal indexes. Of course, there are multiple options in this field, but in particular, we focused on the initial slope after the beginning of the cycle, on the so-called steady state temperature. Then we extracted the Q parameter, which is related to the specific heat loss, and it can be measured by measuring the slope of the curve when the cycling loading is stopped. Then we measured the area below the curve to extract an energy parameter. And then you may have noticed that at the beginning and at the end of the test, we have these 2 spikes in the temperature. These are related to essentially the thermoelastic effect when we apply the mean stress and when we release it separately from the cyclic loading at the end of the test. Now, having all these thermal indexes, we follow what is usually done in the literature. So they are most often plotted against the applied stress. So what you get is a diagram which qualitatively looks like this, where you have 2 main regions. And then there are different strategies that you can use to, let's say, identify the fatigue limit, which is associated with the transition from the first region to the second one. And there are different methods in literature. We focused on the first one, which is the 1-cube method, which essentially does not consider the first part of the test results and focus only on the area where the thermal index varies more significantly. And then there are the so-called 2-cubes methods that can be implemented in different ways, but basically you fit both parts of the diagram with the different lines. So in this slide, you can see, let's say, a general summary of the result. So the point of this slide is just to show one result which was not obvious at the beginning, at least for us, and it's that the type of diagram that you get is actually comparable qualitatively with what you get for conventional metals. And that is important because, let's say, it's possibly an indication that the method can work for additive manufacturing also. The second observation, you can see that the cubes changes depending on the material condition. For example, for the annealing condition, which is the first one, you have a different type of response in comparison with the last one, which is direct aging, which is a very different heat treatment. So the second, let's say, indication is that the method is actually sensitive to the material condition. Then you see three different type of index in this case, and I have summarized the results in this table. In this case, what we have found is that there were no significant difference between using the initial slope or the steady temperature or the Q parameter. So except, let's say, one case, which is the stress relief condition, basically, we get very consistent prediction. In all cases, we have this transition at a characteristic level, so it was, let's say, possible to identify a fatigue limit. Maybe the only difference among the three indexes is that when we apply the steady temperature, the deviation, the standard deviation are more favorable. So the second type of comparison was among the fitting method. So here we can see an example for the stress relief against the annealing condition. What we can see, especially if we compare the numbers, is that if we take an average value, considering for each fitting strategy, the mean result of all the thermal indexes that we have investigated, is again that there is no clear difference between the various fitting strategies. For at least in this case study, this was not a really significant parameter. Now, in this slide, I just would like to show you maybe the most important comparison, which is the comparison between infrared thermography prediction and what we have got from conventional testing. So in the first column, you can see the range of values that we have got from infrared thermography, considering all the thermal indexes and all the fitting strategies. Then you have the second and the third column. So this is the ratio between the value that we predicted and, let's say, the fatigue strength that we estimated in case the test is stopped after 1 million cycle or after 2 million cycles. And this number of cycles is actually what you often see, at least in some literature paper, for this material. So we had, for example, for this Inconel alloy data at 2 million cycles from the literature. Now, if we consider these values, we can see that the ratio are, in most cases, close to unity. Let's say, in some cases, we have differences in the order of 5 to 15, maybe 20%, but I think it's reasonably good. What is very different is what happens if you compare the prediction with infrared thermography and what happens at 20 million cycles. Because in reality, what we observed is that in some cases we had failures for load levels, stress level, lower than the predicted fatigue limit. So this, let's say, was a puzzling result, but we try to explain it with two different aspects. So the first one is that if you test at 20 million cycles, basically you are testing the material with low stress. So low stress means that the thermal response that you will activate will be limited. So you will face very small thermal variation, very small temperature variation. So it's more difficult to catch this variation accurately, or maybe could be a limitation of our setup. And the other possible explanation is instead that we are facing a material in which we have defects inside. So it may happen that the fatigue is triggered by a defect, which is not activating some, let's say, mechanism that generate heat on the surface. So you don't get on the surface any advice that something is happening because fatigue is propagating from an inner defect. And essentially, we've got the same type of interpretation for this result. Here you can see the results elaborated using the energy parameter that I mentioned before. Now, it has been postulated that if you have a test in which you carry out a series of block testing up to failure, and you take the energy for each block, and then you sum this energy, what you get, let's say, is a number that in some way is a sort of material properties, because it's, let's say, related to the energy that the material is capable in some way to withstand. So if you assume that this postulate is true, then you can, let's say, plot a stress life curve, and you can compare it with a conventional one, which I did not report here, but again, you have a good correlation for high stress, and the two curves instead generally diverge when the stress level is low. So I'm approaching conclusion. I don't know if I have time to just to show you this final slide. So you may remember I mentioned at the beginning that in our test protocol, we applied separately the mean stress and the cyclic part of the loading. So at the beginning and at the end of the test, you have these two spikes where you have essentially a thermoelastic effect. So one question that we wondered was, can we see any difference before and after the application of the cyclic loading between these two peaks? Because the idea is that if you're actually damaging the material, maybe if you compare what happens when you release the stress with what was happening at the beginning of the test, maybe you can get, let's say, a first indication, sort of warning, that maybe the material is getting damaged. Now, at the moment, this slide is just more question mark, because we plotted the results for each of the tests, and in some cases, you can see apparently there's a trend. In some cases, you can see that there is a difference among the finishing phase and the initial phase, that this difference depends on the stress level, but I would say it's probably too early, or we don't have enough data to draw a definitive conclusion. And just to conclude my presentation, my basic message is, on one end, we have found that infrared thermography can be a valuable tool for fast screening among different conditions of material. For example, you vary the parameters and you want to have a quick assessment of which could be the most favorable condition. On the other end, we are facing some limitations that we think are related to the presence of defects in the additive manufacturing materials. So that the prediction, especially for high cycle number, is not perfectly good. So I've concluded, so thank you for your attention, and of course I'm available for questions and for suggestions as well.